Now I'm going to talk about the start of a short story, which is really, really important. And some of the rules of this apply to novels as well as short stories. I think, given how quick and striking a flash fiction story is, I think this is even more important. And it might take you a long time to be happy with your first sentence. So I think the first sentence has to do two or three things to be really effective. The first is it has to grab the reader, because you only have a couple of pages, or 2 or 3 pages in a flash fiction, and you have to grab the reader and make them not put your story down. 2, you have to plunge the reader into the character that you're writing about. And 3, you have to establish with that same first sentence the mood of your story. You don't want to write a first sentence that suggests a particular theme or mood and then moves away from that later. So it really is important, and it's got to do a whole lot of stuff very quickly. So when we look back at editing this particular part of the short story is really important, and by extension of that, the first paragraph as well. I have 3 sentences here that are opening sentences. The last is mine that I kind of thought about this morning preparing for this. And the first one is from 1984, and the second one is from Sylvia Plath's only novel. And I think they're really important because they not only kind of grab your attention really quickly because you think, what on earth's going on, but they also set a really interesting mood. So the first one is the first sentence of 1984, one of my favourites, which is, "It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. What I find fascinating with that is that it asks questions immediately. So the first thing you think is, clocks don't strike 13, they only strike 12. So what on earth is happening? Why are these clocks striking 13? It doesn't use a trivial detail from daily life of that world, but it uses something very profound, a sense of time. So it's very clever in that it picks our curiosity, but it picks something that at first seems benign, but actually is quite profound. What civilization has actually changed the notion of time? So very, very quickly, and it's a very short sentence, it gives you something kind of kinesthetic, like it was a cold April day, something we can relate to, clock striking, but then just in that last word, it spins us 360 with 13, so it's quite clever. And you really want to read on and find out what's going on in that story. So I think that's fantastic. The next one by Sylvia Plath is a really interesting one too. I think it is better in striking a mood perhaps, but I think it's also a very clever first line. It begins, "It was a queer, sultry summer, the summer they electrocuted the Rosenbergs, and I didn't know what I was doing in New York." You get a better sense of character from that first sentence than you do with Orwell, because immediately we know, well, we have the beginning of the voice. We have that shocking juxtaposition of the electrocution of people with a sultry summer, sort of ordinary day in that particular city. So again, it uses tactile, sensory kind of information and juxtaposing it with something quite dramatic to kind of reel you into the story. And in this case, it introduces you to the main character. Now, this is a first sentence that's obviously not in the same league as those first 2 sentences, but it's something I was thinking about as an example of my own. And I'm not even sure how this kind of story would end either. But this is my little invention for the purposes of this, and that is, "The newborn held out its hand, and the father reached for him, but stopped. He couldn't touch that tiny hand." Why I think that works as a first sentence, and I have no idea where that's going, and I think I'm going to use that as an opening first line in the workshop that's coming up next weekend. Why I think that's an interesting and perhaps compelling first sentence is we have, again, this juxtaposition. So we have a normal moment. Obviously, the child is, newborn. We can all relate to that either through the experience of our parents or having children of our own. And a normal touching moment, when a parent reaches out to their newborn child and they want that first physical contact, and we have that juxtaposed with the stop. And then the additional information, he couldn't touch that hand. So it raises all sorts of really interesting questions. And also, of course, introduces us to the character. So like the Plath first sentence, we know that it's about the father. So what I think those three sentences have in common is, one, they're very arresting. You want to find out what happens because they raise questions. Two, they juxtapose ideas, which increases tension and makes you wonder what's going on. And three, to lesser or greater extents, you have a sense of character coming out in those as well. I think what else these three sentences do well is, as I said before, they raise questions that are going to be answered later. And a good opening sentence doesn't just set the scene, but it has to establish very clearly what the questions are, or what, and I'll talk about this in a further recording, what the problem is for the character, or problems in the sense of a novel. And I think these three do those really well. Now, I write differently. There are different ways you can write. I write often with the first sentence or the last sentence in my head, and then it kind of gets glued together and develops from there. Many people don't start that way, so they have an idea broadly of a story, but they're not sure exactly how to start that story. My advice, following on from the first video, would be just to start writing. And in the editing process, you can highlight a sentence that you might find as an opportunity to begin your work, or you might furiously revise that first sentence and that first paragraph. What I think will become apparent in your editing, and what I think is very apparent in these three opening sentences too, is a good first sentence not only hooks the reader, but it throws us into the action immediately. So a common trap for writers, beginning writers, is to start off with something that kind of sets the scene and sort of preambles into the story, but doesn't actually throw you into the action. To give you an example with my story, I could have started off with something like the newborn baby slept quietly in its crib. The mother touched its hand. I could have made a comment about the light coming through the window, yada, yada, yada. But that doesn't really hook your reader. So for me, the essential part of that story is the fact that the father can't connect with the baby. And so therefore, if that's the essential core of the story, then you have to start there. You've noticed too with the newborn story that there's a particular mood I've tried to kind of create too. So it's very personal. You know it's going to be a psychological sort of interior story. And with the Plath example, it was a queer, sultry summer, the summer that electrocuted the Rosenbergs. It clearly puts it in a particular time and place, and you get the feeling it's going to be hot and sticky and claustrophobic, and the novel does indeed follow along with that mood. I think although George Orwell's opening line, "It was bright, cold day in April and the clocks were striking 13, doesn't strike as strong a mood as the other two, but since the novel's preoccupied with the loss of personal liberty, the strictures of systems and people as tools of systems, starting off with something as profound as time and time being changed, I think still does effectively establish an interesting mood to the story. And apparently George Orwell spent a long time agonising over that first sentence and first paragraph. And Stephen King was known on a particular novel to spend as much as 2 years rewriting the first page or two of a novel. So it's really important to get those right. Having said that, don't let that be a block to you starting your writing, because you can always do that in editing later. My last novel, The Nail House, I rewrote the opening page I don't know how many times, and there were many decisions about where to start the point, and I wrote from two different characters' point of view. Whose character do I start from, and what does that say about the story? And that took many, many months to figure out. And you can test on people too. So I think, again, my first advice stands. Just start writing, because you can establish this all a bit later on. But in your first draft, you might write something, and it might be in the third paragraph, and you think, wow, that's brilliant. That could be my opening sentence, or in fact, I might delete those first couple of paragraphs or move some of the detail ahead and start here. So to recap, first sentence and first paragraph really is about mood. It's about the hook. It's about grabbing the reader's attention and making them read on, because people read an awful lot, even if they say they don't. They're reading stuff online, they're reading other stories and articles, and you want to hook them in, and it's a very sort of competitive mind space. And third, you want to introduce your character and the problem or the tension that's in your story. So all that has to happen really quickly. In a novel, I would say that happens in the first couple of paragraphs, and usually if people are browsing in a bookshop, they only read the first paragraph or two before deciding whether to buy or not. But given the short nature of flash fiction, you've got one sentence pretty much. So I hope that encourages you. Don't let it be a hang-up. Just write. And again, this is something you can identify as you draft your story. Some people really like to plan their stories out, and in the next video, I will talk about one particular way that you can plan out your story, but it's by no means the be and end all. And if you do a bit of research, you'll find writers work in many different ways. But I'll look at one way you can plan for those of you who do like to plan or have a more developed idea. And we'll look at that next time. Thank you again for watching, and keep writing.